Check this out. This is the docs for the QInput component, and this is the docs for the file picker, and this is the docs for the select component. Notice that the design for all of these is basically the exact same. And that's because they're all using a component. They're all actually wrapped in a component, which is the QField component. And that's what we're going to be exploring in this video. So just like how we've got input, file picker, and select that are all using the same component, I'm going to show you how we can use the field component to basically make our own field components. And this means that we have access to a lot of the APIs that are in, for example, QInput. And by that, I mean stuff like field, outline, borderless, all of the error handling stuff. So if we come down here to validation, all these validation related logic where we can have the validation showing at the bottom there, we get all that functionality for free when we use the QField component. And all we have to implement is this part in the middle here. Okay, this will make a lot more sense throughout the video. So let's move on. Now, usually in these videos, I just throw the component directly in here. However, due to the way the QField component works, I'm actually going to create a separate component for it. It doesn't really make sense to use it directly on the page. I mean, there's some scenarios where you might do that, but usually you're going to have a separate file for your component. So let's say Quasar, new, and we'll call this field component. Oh, and I need to specify also that this is a component. So Quasar new component field component. And there we go. Now we've got a new file here. So let's control click that to open it up. And we can start playing around with it. First of all, I'll actually get rid of the entire script section. We probably won't need it for most of this video. And now let's throw in here a Q-field, save it. And the next thing we need to do is actually use this field component. So let's say Control 2 to split the screen here. And next, I'll throw this across here and basically just give us some more space. There we go. So now let's jump into our index page here and use that component. It's called the field component. We can import that and we can pull that directly out of components because we do have an alias for components. So let's save it and see what happens. There we go. Looks very similar to a QInput component. Now the main thing you need to know about is a special slot we get with QField, and that's basically for the meat of the component, for the middle section here. I'll show you what I mean. Let's come in here and then add a slot, template, and the slot name is control. So we're also going to pull the scope out of here, save it, and I actually want to have something in there. So let's come in here and spit out the scope. We'll have a pre-tag, and then we'll just whack the scope directly in there so we can see what it looks like. Okay, so that's feeding us the ID, which is going to be randomly generated by default. Whether or not it's editable, so if I come in here and say disable, for example, it's going to say false because if it's disabled, it cannot be edited. Whether or not it's focused, so let's get rid of disable and then come in here and click on it and notice that focus changes between false and true. And the last one is floating label, which I'll show you in a bit. Now let's come up here and model something. So let's say v-model and we're going to say age because I'm going to put the QSlider component inside of this QField component. And we're going to use that slider component to basically change the user's age. So now I can come down here and then say const age is equal to a ref. Let's bring in ref. And how about we set it to 17 by default. And there we go. Notice now that model value is showing up. And that's because we're modeling something which behind the scenes is going to send through a model value. And one more thing I want to show you here, if I copy paste that down, is we also have scope.emit value. Save it. And this is how we change the value of the field. Now, the reason we do everything through the scope here via this control slot is really interesting. By saying emit value this way, by basically doing it through this scope slot, we allow QField to know what the value is as it changes. And if QField knows what the value is, it's then able to do things like show errors if the value is wrong. So it means that we can start adding error rules to our QField. It means the clearable button will work. Little things like that are going to work if we use this control template here, this control slot. Again, this will make more sense as we continue with the example. Okay, let's come down here and do a basic example by saying input. And inside of that input, I'm just going to pass through the value. So the value is equal to scope.value. Save it. Oh, and it's actually scope.modelValue. There we go. So now that number is being passed. So it comes in here. It gets passed through to the control through the scope slot, and then it gets passed through here into the input. So there's a few things happening here. Now let's show the value down here by having a pre-tag, and we'll spit out the age there. There we go. So we can see the age at the bottom. And now when I change this, it should change that age, right? So let's change it to 22, but notice that it doesn't work. In fact, it just changes back when we unfocus the field. And that's because when the value changes on the input, like I mentioned before, we need to use emit value to basically let QField know that the value has changed. So now we can come in here and say at input, and since we're using a native input, we need to do a little bit more work than what we're used to with Quasar components. We have to grab the event, and then we have to say scope.emit value, and the value is going to be event.target.value. So let's save that, refresh the page, and let's see if this works now. 22, and it does. Now I don't know what that red squiggly is about, but I think we can ignore it. Yeah, it seems to be working anyway, so you can ignore that. Now another thing that we want to do, and this is quite important, is make sure that we pass that ID down into this field. This is an accessibility thing. So if we come in here and we say that the label is equal to something like age, save it, and there we go. Notice we now get this age label showing up. And now if I also say for, which you usually want to do when you're using an input component, by the way, if we say for and give it a name like age, what happens behind the scenes is, I'll show you actually what happens behind the scenes. Control-Shift-I, we'll click on age here. And if we scroll up, notice that on the label, it sets for equal to age. So it's saying this label is for the component that has an ID of age. So now to make sure that this label is matched up to the underlying component that it belongs to, we want to take this ID property and add it into the input field. And I'll show you how we do that. Come in here and we say ID is equal to scope.id. So just another one of those little things that you need to know. Now let's comment this out and see what it looks like. There we go. We've basically re-implemented Quasar's Quasar's Q input component. Obviously, Quasar's doing a whole lot more than this, but you get the idea. Okay, let's bring these back in because I want them visible whilst we're building the component. And then we'll come in here and change this. Let me just give you some more room. We'll change this to a Q-slider component. Q-slider, and we're basically going to do the same thing but with the slider component. This is a more useful example. So we set the model-value equal to scope.modelValue, save it, and let's do a refresh here. Now of course, as we move this, nothing actually changes, and that's because we have to come in here and then say at input is equal to, and I think we can just pass directly through there, scope.emit value, because that will take the value of the input and send it through to this function, emit value. Let's see if that works. Might have to refresh the page. It didn't, so let's try this. Take the value and then send it through to scope.emit value. Refresh the page. Oh, I know what I've done wrong. It's not at input. Let me just Control-Z that a few times. It's at update model value. I think I was writing some Vue 2 code just then. All right, let's see if this works. And now it works. So there we go. You can just send that directly through. Once again, we need the ID passed down so that the label knows what it's connected to. ID is equal to scope.id. And there's a few other things that you might want to do to make this example complete. Like if I come in here and say disable, save it, I might actually still be able to change that. Oh no, it's not letting me change it. I thought maybe we'd have to add disable to the slider, but it looks like it just disables the entire area. So that's kind of cool. Let's have a look at read only. So it does look like when we have read only, we're still able to change the slider. However, since we've got this editable value, which is set to false, what I can do here is say disable on the slider. Let's just see if that works. Save it, refresh the page. Yeah, and then what we can do here is say that it's disabled if we have scope.editable Well, if that's set to false, so we've got to negate that. Let's have a look. And now I can no longer change that value even when it's set to read only. So that's good to know. You've got that functionality there. We know whether or not it's editable because it can be passed through the scope. Now, that's pretty much it. There's still a couple of things here and there you could do. For example, the color. So maybe we want to pass through a color here. How about we set it equal to purple? And then in this case, I can just grab the attribute directly from adders. So I can say here the color is equal to, and then we can say $adders.purple. Save it, refresh the page. Oh, sorry, not purple, color. And there we go. That's working now. But what if we have no color? What's going to happen then? There we go. It's automatically set that to blue. I think what's happened is this doesn't exist, and since it doesn't exist, it just defaults it to the primary color. So that works really well. Let's get rid of all of this now. Save it. Now, one thing I want to note is if we want to add in the label for the slider, I'll show you what that looks like. If we say label here, that should mean that when we're sliding it, we get a label. Yeah, notice that it kind of covers the label of the input though. So what would be cool is if it's flipped sides when we get close to the age label there. I reckon that'd be cool. So I just want to show you an example with that. Even if you might not use this in the real world, you kind of have to see if it fits your scenario. This will be a good opportunity to show the breadth of this component. So let's come in here and then we'll say switch dash label. And look, if we set that to true, then it means the label is going to show on the other side. Might have to refresh. We need to say switch label dash side. Refresh again. And there we go. We can switch the label side. So what I can do now is say, hey, if the scope.model value is less than, how about 6? Let's save that. If it's less than 6, then I want you to switch the side. And there we go. How cool is that? But rather than 6, that looks like it needs to be a larger number. So let's try 7, maybe even 8 there. And see if that works out okay. Yeah, you get the idea. With this extra flexibility, we can do some interesting things. And here's this other idea I had. You could come in here and then say class is equal to, and if the scope's model value is less than 8, all right, so we'll turn that into a ternary and give ourselves some more space here. If it's less than 8, then put some margining on the bottom. And the reason I want margining on the bottom is because we're getting a bit of overlap here with that label. So how about this? Q-margin bottom is equal to large. Otherwise, just nothing. Let's see how that works out. And there we go. That gives us the space we need on the bottom. And if we don't want this bottom line to basically flick up and down, what we could do is say margin top large here otherwise. So check this out. Now the margin is at the top, but when it changes, the margin goes on the bottom. So I reckon that's kind of a cool example. Now, obviously, if you had different labels, you'd have to account for that and then change this number depending on the label, but you can play around with that. The next thing I want to do is show you this with a different component. So let's change it from a QSlider to a QDate. And instead of replacing it, I might just add in QDate, and then we'll go through these things one at a time and see what we'll keep and see what we'll get rid of. First of all, let's change this ref to null, or just nothing even. Yeah, there we go. And wow, it looks like that just works by default. So that's pretty cool. We'd probably get rid of that because we don't need the class stuff anymore. Switch label and label don't make sense with this component. We might keep the color stuff. That might be interesting. We'll keep this disable thing because that's probably also going to work with this component. ID, model value. I think that's about it. Let's save it. Refresh the page. So we've got a little bit of a problem here. Notice that the label is overlapping, but when I click on the component, it no longer overlaps. So there's two ways you can solve this. We can come in here and basically stack that by saying stack dash label. Sorry, this is meant to be on the QField. Stack label. And that means that by default, it's going to be stacked. So you might do this and then add a bit of margining. So maybe Q-margin top small, save it, refresh the page. Yeah, and you could just leave it at that. And by the way, I think I'd probably flatten this too. Let's say flat there. It needs a border as well, so maybe flat and bordered. Yeah, I think that looks a little bit better. And if you didn't want to stack the label, you could get rid of stack label and then just maybe add some more margining here. So large might do. Refresh the page. And there we go. I think that looks a little bit silly. So to be honest, I think I would just leave stack label and have that small margin at the top. I think this is a better example. Yeah. Now let's see if the color part works. We'll say color is equal to purple. Make sure I spell purple properly. Third time's a charm. Purple. Yeah, so that's being proxied through to the date, which is kind of cool. And one more thing that you might need to do is add a few properties here that can then be sent through to the date. And there's two ways you could achieve that. You could come in here and say, for example, date dash adders, something like that, and then send them directly through. Then what you could do is say v-bind is equal to adders dot date adders. So let's save that. And a good way to test this would be just to get rid of color there. And let's say color is equal to purple. See if that still works for changing the color. All right, I might not be able to use this casing. So let's try date dash adders. Save it, refresh the page. Oh, and last of all, let's get rid of this color attribute. All right, so that works. This is one thing you could do. You could basically just say, hey, if you want any date attributes, then just send them directly through like this. Or you could do them individually. So whenever there's something that you actually need, some functionality that you need, you could just come in here and like we did with the color, just pass it through manually and sort of add them in one at a time as your application needs it. So there's two ways that you could go about that. The second way is probably going to end up with, I guess, a cleaner, more interesting API, because then you're only throwing attributes on here. Whereas this means that you're covering all use cases by just adding an object in there. So there's two options that you can explore depending on what you want to try. All right, moving on. One more thing I did want to mention is that we also have error handling. So you can say error, for example, here, and that puts it into an error state. And then error message, basically any of the error related stuff, putting in rules as well. Because we're modeling things this way, where we've got update model and we're using the scope here, and because the model value is being sent through using the scope, by doing these two things, it means that we can use all of the field related stuff like error messages, checking rules, so we can send a rules array in there with any errors that we might have. All of that stuff is going to work. And in fact, I'll give you a quick example of this. How about we add a required rule? Take in the value, and I want you to make sure that we actually have a value. And if we don't, then say field is required, something like that. And let's see if this works. I focus it, unfocus it. Since there's no value, we get the error message. Otherwise, it's totally fine with it. So that's pretty insane. We get all of that flexibility for free. And even other stuff like hints. So hint is equal to enter a valid date. And then maybe you'd also put the format in there. You can kind of do whatever you want. And yeah, all of that is completely free because we've wrapped this inside of the QField component. And once again, if you want to know what's available here, then just check out the QInput docs or the QInput video that I made. And basically everything in that video is also going to be available now on this component because we're using a QField. So there's some exceptions like the mask, for example, but for the most part, they're both just going to work together. Okay, I know I'm bouncing around a little bit here. There is one last thing that I want to show you to wrap up this video, and that's using slots. By default, if I come in here and try and use a slot, it's not going to work. So let's say template, and then we can say after is equal to, we don't need an equal to there, and then we can just add in a Q-icon, and let's give that icon a name equal to book. And that's not working. And there's two ways that we can solve this. I'll show you the first way. You can basically add in slots as you need them. So we could say slot, and then we could give it a name which is equal to after, and throw that inside of the QField after slot. Sorry, I've done this wrong. I'm going to cut this, and it actually needs to sit outside here inside of the QField component. So in other words, if we add a slot in there for after, then it's going to come into the after slot here, hashtag after, and then we can paste that in there. We're going to slot it into the template here. So let's refresh the page, and now that's working. So essentially what we're doing here, let me just run through it one more time. We're saying, hey, I want to use the after slot in this component, And then in the QField component, we say, hey, inside of the after slot, add a slot for whatever was passed through. Let me explain this another way. Since we're using the after slot, that gets sent directly into here. I know this can be like a little bit difficult to wrap your head around because we're kind of like doing some slot inception here. But maybe just pause the video and look at this for a while until it makes sense, because I know it can be a bit complicated. Okay, so that's one way to do it. And a benefit to this is you could also have a default value here. So I could come in there and say q-icon, and let's say that the name of that is equal to book, save it, refresh the page. And now if I get rid of this book, so let's comment that out and refresh the page again, we still get a book, but we can change this to something else. How about check, save it, and now it's a check. So we can kind of use this as a default slot by doing it this way. Now the other thing we can do is basically proxy all slots that are available on the QField component. So any slots that the QField has available, and proxy them right through depending on what the parent has sent. So I'll show you what I mean by that. That was way too many words all at once. We can say template here, v-4 is equal to, so yes, you can do a for loop on a template. And then we can accept here some values. I'm going to accept underscore because we don't actually need that first value. So underscore is another way of saying a value that I'm not actually going to use. And then I can say slot here. Then we can say of $slots. So basically what we're doing here is we're iterating over every single slot that was passed through. Then we can say the name of this slot is equal to, so this is just like using normal slots where you might say after, for example. But what you can do is add brackets here and then say slot, which means the variable here of slot is going to be passed through here as the name of the slot. All right, have I still got you? Probably not, because I've almost lost myself. Now inside of here, we pass the slot. Set that name equal to, we need the colon, the slot. Whew, okay, hopefully this is starting to make sense. We iterate through every single slot that was passed through. We set the name of the slot, so the template here is going to match up with the name of the slot that was passed through. And then we slot it in to the QField component. All right, so let's save that. You might have to go sit under a tree and ponder this one for a while, but let's see if it works. All right, so we're still getting that check, which is a good sign. And let's try using another slot. I'll copy paste this down and let's try the before slot. Save it and it works. How cool is that? So if you want all of the slots available inside of this component, you can use this pattern. And by the way, I use this pattern a lot, especially if, for example, you want to wrap a QTable component and you want all of the slots that QTable has to offer you, because the QTable component has a lot of useful slots and often you want to utilize, well, a lot of them. So in that case, you might use this pattern to make sure that everything is proxied through. This is really great for wrapping components. So that's about it for this video. That's the QField component. Really, really handy. And another one to watch after this one is the QInput component if you want to know all the other stuff that we have available on here. So stuff like field, which is going to add the field style, outline, or outlined with a D, all that good stuff you can find on the QInput video. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one.